In 1938, a couple walking along a riverbank near the tiny town of London, Texas, noticed something strange sticking out of a rock. A piece of wood protruded from a sandstone lump, as if a branch had somehow fused into stone. They took it home, tossed it onto a fireplace shelf, and forgot about it for nearly a decade. Then, in 1947, their son cracked the rock open. Inside was a hammer. Not a primitive stone tool, not a sharpened bone. A real iron hammer with a wooden handle, sealed inside rock supposedly hundreds of thousands of years old. According to early estimates, the surrounding stone dated anywhere from 100,000 to 300,000 years back. That was impossible. Humans weren't forging iron 300,000 years ago. At that point in history, early hominids were barely shaping crude stone implements. Yet there it was, a manufactured hammer trapped inside ancient rock, as if someone had dropped it long before recorded civilization even existed. The object became known as the London Hammer, one of the most controversial, impossible artifacts ever discovered. To some, it was proof of a forgotten advanced civilization. Others claimed it hinted at extraterrestrial visitors. Skeptics dismissed it as a geological misunderstanding. But before deciding who was right, there's a larger question worth asking. Because the London Hammer is far from the only object that seems out of place in human history. For more than 2 centuries, stories have surfaced about so-called OOP arts, out-of-place artifacts. The term was popularized in the 1960s by naturalist Ivan Sanderson and refers to objects found in locations or geological layers where they seemingly do not belong. Iron nails inside coal seams, gold chains embedded in rock, metallic spheres buried in ancient strata. Every discovery carried the same uncomfortable implication. What if our understanding of the past is incomplete? The London Hammer became the perfect symbol of that idea. What do we actually know for certain? The hammer is real. It still exists today inside a small museum in Texas run by creationist Carl Baugh, who uses it as evidence against mainstream geology and evolutionary timelines. The tool itself is small, roughly 6 inches long, with a partially mineralized wooden handle and an iron head unusually resistant to corrosion. That composition fueled even more speculation. Tests reportedly showed the metal was almost pure iron, with traces of chlorine and sulfur, unlike most modern industrial alloys. Supporters of the artifact's mystery argued that such purity suggested unknown manufacturing techniques. Combined with the partially fossilized handle and stone encasing, they believed the conclusion was obvious. Someone built this hammer long before recorded civilization. At first glance, the argument sounds compelling. Then, geology enters the conversation. Professional geologists point out a critical distinction. The age of the surrounding rock does not automatically equal the age of the object inside it. Mineral-rich water can harden around relatively modern items and create stone-like concretions within decades. A tool dropped into a crack in limestone can gradually become encased until it appears ancient, even when it isn't. In other words, the rock may be old, while the hammer itself is not. There were other problems too. The hammer was never excavated professionally. No photographs documented its original position. No stratigraphic analysis was performed. No independent team observed the discovery. Archaeology depends on context, and once an object is removed from its original environment, most of its scientific value disappears. All we truly have is a story A family found a rock with wood sticking out of it, and later revealed a hammer inside. Even the hammer's design weakens the mystery. Its proportions closely resemble ordinary mining and masonry hammers used throughout 19th century America. Texas mining communities regularly lost tools in caves, riverbeds, and fractured limestone formations. A hammer from the 1800s falling into a mineral-rich crevice could eventually emerge looking far older than it actually was. But here's the twist. The skeptical explanation also remains unproven. No complete independent radiocarbon analysis has ever been publicly performed on the handle. The surrounding material was never thoroughly examined using modern geological methods, capable of determining whether the stone formed around the hammer later or whether the object was genuinely embedded much earlier. Carl Baugh has repeatedly limited independent access to the artifact, which only deepened suspicion on both sides. So the London hammer remains suspended between explanation and myth. Not verified, not fully debunked. The perfect artifact for endless arguments. And it's only the beginning. In 1885, miners in Austria uncovered another strange object inside a block of lignite coal, supposedly millions of years old. The item became known as the Salzburg Cube, a small metallic object with sharp edges and a deep groove running around its center. Some claimed it was evidence of prehistoric technology. Others suggested extraterrestrial origins. Years later, further analysis produced a far less dramatic conclusion. It was most likely a cast iron component from 19th century mining machinery accidentally mixed into the coal during excavation. That pattern repeats constantly in the world of impossible artifacts. Ancient geological layers become contaminated by modern tools. Mining operations disturb strata. Construction mixes materials from different eras. Archaeologists call this intrusion, when newer objects penetrate older layers and create the illusion of impossible age. Many mysteries collapse under closer inspection, but not all of them. One discovery genuinely shocked historians, because, unlike the London hammer, its authenticity was never in doubt. In 1901, sponge divers exploring a Roman shipwreck near the Greek island of Antikythera recovered a corroded bronze lump from the seafloor. At first, it looked insignificant. Then, scientists cleaned it. Inside was a machine, a complex arrangement of more than 30 interlocking bronze gears, engineered with astonishing precision. Over decades of study using X-rays and computer reconstruction, researchers realized they were looking at an ancient analog computer capable of predicting eclipses, tracking planetary motion, and modeling astronomical cycles with incredible sophistication. The Antikythera Mechanism came from around the 2nd century BC. Nothing comparable would appear again in Europe for more than 1,000 years. Unlike the London hammer, the Antikythera Mechanism does not violate chronology. Its age and origin are known, but it shattered assumptions about ancient technological capability. It proved that human progress is not always linear. Knowledge can emerge, flourish, and disappear. The Romans lost advanced concrete formulas. Greek fire vanished from history. Damascus steel became impossible to reproduce for centuries. Entire technologies have been forgotten before. That realization matters. Because once you accept that civilizations can lose knowledge, the line between skepticism and curiosity becomes far thinner than most people realize. Still, lost knowledge is very different from a civilization hundreds of thousands of years older than humanity itself. The Antikythera Mechanism is extraordinary, but it doesn't rewrite human history. It simply proves ancient people were far more capable than we once believed. Other artifacts push the debate much further. For decades, miners in South Africa uncovered strange metallic-looking spheres buried deep inside pyrophyllite deposits, estimated to be nearly 3 billion years old. The objects were small, smooth, and in some cases marked by perfectly parallel grooves running around their circumference. Photographs spread rapidly through books, documentaries, and early internet forums. To believers, the spheres looked manufactured. Some called them prehistoric machine parts. Others claimed they were evidence of an impossibly ancient civilization. Geologists eventually offered a less dramatic explanation. The spheres were natural mineral concretions formed through slow geological processes. The grooves came from layered crystal growth and pressure patterns inside the surrounding rock. Nature, it turns out, can produce shapes that appear engineered. Snowflakes, basalt columns, crystal formations. Symmetry alone is not proof of intelligence. But the fascination never disappeared. Because impossible artifacts are rarely just about the objects themselves. They tap into something deeper, the suspicion that history may be incomplete. That's why discoveries like the so-called Baghdad Batteries continue to attract attention. These were clay jars found near Baghdad, containing copper cylinders and iron rods. When filled with acidic liquid such as vinegar or grape juice, they could generate a small electric current. The jars dated back roughly 2,000 years. Some researchers suggested they may have been primitive batteries used for electroplating jewelry. Others argued the electrical effect was accidental and the vessel served an entirely different purpose. The debate remains unresolved because no definitive evidence connects the jars to ancient electrical technology. But uncertainty creates space for imagination, and imagination is where impossible artifacts thrive. Supporters of alternative history often make one central argument. There are simply too many anomalies for all of them to be mistakes. One strange artifact could be contamination. 10 could be coincidence. Hundreds begin to feel like a pattern. Critics respond with an equally powerful counter-argument. Most of these discoveries emerged during the 19th and early 20th centuries, long before modern archaeological standards existed. Objects were removed without documentation. Geological context was ignored. Stories spread through newspapers and magazines before experts could investigate properly. In many cases, the original artifacts disappeared entirely, leaving behind only second-hand accounts impossible to verify. And there's another problem. Mysteries survive because mysteries are profitable. Nobody watches a 2-hour documentary titled "It Turned Out to Be a Normal Hammer." But 300,000-year-old artifact discovered in stone generates millions of clicks instantly. Sensational explanations spread faster than careful scientific corrections, creating the illusion that impossible artifacts are far more common than they really are. Then comes the strongest skeptical argument of all. If an advanced civilization had existed on Earth hundreds of thousands or millions of years ago, it would not leave behind a single hammer. It would leave massive geological evidence. Mines, roads, industrial pollution, synthetic materials, chemical signatures trapped inside sediment layers and ice cores. Modern civilization has existed for only a brief moment in geological time, yet traces of us are everywhere. Plastic particles rest on the ocean floor. Radioactive isotopes from nuclear testing are frozen into Antarctic ice. Carbon emissions have altered atmospheric chemistry worldwide. An ancient industrial civilization would likely leave similar scars. So where are they? That question led to one of the strangest scientific papers ever seriously discussed by mainstream researchers. In 2018, astrophysicist Gavin Schmidt and astrobiologist Adam Frank proposed something called the Silurian hypothesis, named after a fictional reptilian species from Doctor Who. They were not claiming ancient civilizations existed before humanity. Instead, they asked a purely scientific question. If an industrial civilization had existed millions of years ago, would we even be able to detect it today? The answer was unsettling. Probably not easily. Over millions of years, erosion destroys cities. Plate tectonics recycle crust, metals oxidize, concrete crumbles into dust, forests swallow roads, oceans erase coastlines. Given enough time, most direct evidence of civilization disappears completely. The only lasting traces might be subtle chemical anomalies buried in ancient sediments, sudden carbon spikes, unusual isotope ratios, synthetic compounds, or signs of rapid climate disruption. In other words, if scientists are searching for prehistoric civilizations, looking for hammers inside rocks may be the wrong approach entirely. That doesn't prove such civilizations existed, but it changes the question. Instead of asking, "Where are the ancient machines?" researchers begin asking, "Would we recognize the evidence if it were already in front of us?" That distinction matters more than most people realize, because science is filled with discoveries that were ignored for decades simply because nobody knew how to interpret them. Fossils were once mistaken for dragon bones. Meteorites were dismissed as superstition. Entire species vanished from scientific understanding until new evidence forced experts to reconsider old assumptions. The history of knowledge is also the history of blindness, and impossible artifacts sit directly on that boundary between skepticism and curiosity. That's why the London hammer continues to survive long after most mysteries fade away. Not because it proves anything, but because it sits in an uncomfortable gray zone where certainty collapses. The simplest explanation is probably correct. A 19th century hammer fell into a crack, became encased in mineral deposits, and later emerged looking ancient. By the standards of geology and archaeology, that scenario makes perfect sense. But the artifact was never examined thoroughly enough to close the case completely. And humans hate unfinished stories. We are drawn to unresolved mysteries because they force us to confront the limits of what we know. A single unexplained object becomes a mirror reflecting whatever people already believe. Creationists see evidence against mainstream science. Alternative historians see traces of forgotten civilizations. Skeptics see ordinary objects wrapped in sensational storytelling. The hammer itself remains silent. That silence is what makes it powerful, because beneath every impossible artifact lies the same emotional question. What if humanity's story is far older, stranger, and less complete than we think? It's a dangerous question, because curiosity can easily drift into fantasy. History is full of people who began with legitimate mysteries and ended with wild conspiracies disconnected from evidence. Entire industries now exist around manufacturing pseudo-archaeology for entertainment. Ancient aliens, hidden super-civilizations, lost global empires erased from history. The internet turned uncertainty into a business model. And yet, dismissing every anomaly too quickly carries its own risk. Real scientific breakthroughs often begin as uncomfortable inconsistencies. The first people who suggested continents moved were ridiculed. The idea that stones could fall from the sky sounded absurd before meteorites were accepted scientifically. Entire fields of research emerged because someone refused to ignore evidence that didn't fit existing models. That tension is essential. Science survives not because it has all the answers, but because it constantly tests itself against new questions. Impossible artifacts force those questions into public view. Most eventually receive ordinary explanations. Geological contamination, misidentification, fraud, context errors, wishful thinking. Human beings are remarkably good at seeing patterns where none exist. Once an object is labeled mysterious, every detail surrounding it becomes amplified. Uncertainty transforms into mythology. But occasionally, something real remains underneath the exaggeration. The Antikythera Mechanism is the perfect example. For decades, people underestimated ancient engineering because they assumed technological sophistication belonged exclusively to modern civilization. Then, a corroded lump of bronze pulled from the sea forced historians to rethink what ancient people were capable of building. Not because aliens intervened, not because history was fake, but because human knowledge is fragile. Civilizations rise. Knowledge accumulates. Wars destroy libraries. Empires collapse. Skilled craftsmen die without passing down techniques. Entire technologies vanish. Humanity repeatedly forgets things it once understood. That may be the most important lesson hidden inside these stories. The past is not a straight line leading inevitably toward us. It is a broken landscape filled with missing pieces, and Earth's timeline is unimaginably vast. Our species has existed for roughly 300,000 years. Recorded history covers only a tiny fraction of that. Industrial civilization occupies barely the last few centuries. Compared to the planet's 4.5 billion-year history, all of human civilization is thinner than a layer of dust. We like to imagine we understand our world because we mapped continents and built satellites, but most of Earth's ocean floor remains unexplored. Huge portions of the crust are inaccessible. Ancient geological records are fragmented, compressed, melted, and destroyed by tectonic activity. There are entire chapters of Earth's history we may never recover. That doesn't mean hidden super-civilizations definitely existed. It means certainty is dangerous. The London hammer probably belonged to a miner, farmer, or laborer from the American frontier. A lost tool, nothing more. By every principle of probability, that explanation wins. But probability is not proof. And as long as the artifact remains insufficiently studied, the mystery survives. Maybe that's why these stories never truly disappear. They aren't really about hammers or metallic spheres or ancient batteries. They're about something far more human. The fear that our understanding of reality is incomplete. People want to believe there were others before us because it makes the universe feel less lonely. They want hidden civilizations because hidden civilizations turn history into adventure instead of chronology. A hammer sealed in stone becomes proof that the unknown still exists. And perhaps that's the real reason impossible artifacts are so irresistible. Not because they answer questions, but because they preserve them. Imagine a civilization millions of years from now excavating the remains of ours. They would find plastic buried in ocean sediments, artificial isotopes trapped in ice,
shifting rapidly.
Ruined cities fossilized beneath layers of rock,
Cross-reference it.
satellites drifting silently in orbit, evidence everywhere. There would be no doubt we existed. But suppose another civilization came before us, one without plastics, nuclear reactors, or global industry. One that vanished long enough ago for erosion and tectonics to erase nearly everything it built.
This changes
would
everything
remain?
we thought we knew
Maybe
about
nothing.
the Anthropocene.
Or maybe just one small object trapped inside stone, waiting for someone to find it on the bank of a Texas river. A single artifact too weak to prove anything, yet too strange to ignore. And that possibility, not evidence, not certainty, just possibility, is what keeps the mystery alive.